And we have our new members. I believe we have one from Wethersfield tonight. If you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Let's see. I'm not sure if they've joined us yet, but they might be joining later. So I don't see them here yet.
Okay. All right. Well, we do have one new person. Would someone like to make a motion to approve the minutes from our last meeting? Is everybody unmuted so they can talk?
Eric Thomas from Coventry. I'll make a motion to approve the meeting minutes of November 21st, 24.
And Bill Rice from Simsbury seconds the motion.
Any further comments or discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions?
This is Chris D'Antonio Infield abstaining. And sorry, I joined late.
Any other abstentions? Okay, motion carries.
I will say, Jen, Chris is the new member joining us today, I believe. If you wanted to introduce yourself, Chris.
Yeah, apologies. I'm the new liaison from Wethersfield. Thank you for that. I was not in that meeting, so I would be otherwise abstaining, but thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Chris. Okay, so next item on the agenda is we have Don Poland with us tonight. He's going to talk about market forces impact on land use planning in Connecticut, what land use officials need to understand. So welcome, Don.
Don, I'll stop sharing, and whenever you're ready, feel free to take it over.
Yep, just give me one moment here to share my screen. Hopefully you're seeing the full screen version.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, thanks. So thank you for the introduction. My name's Don Poland. I'm with the firm of Goman York Property Advisors. I've been a planner for, unfortunately, over 30 years now in Connecticut. And this presentation tonight is kind of the outcome of maybe 3 decades of kind of frustration that I've had within the planning profession. And it's a good frustration, but the fact that markets often aren't discussed. And I think it's important when we're thinking about kind of land use and planning to draw some attention to market forces and how it interplays. And I'll share some of my frustrations along the way. I'm not here to criticize, but to just kind of raise awareness around certain things and maybe get you guys as commission members thinking a little bit differently. So with that said, also just so you know, there's a lot of slides in this deck. There's a lot of information on the slides. I'm going to pick and choose where to focus my attention, and Jacob and Krog have access to my slide deck and we'll be able to share it with you if you want to look at certain slides in greater detail. So with that said, let's move along. Just some basic introduction stuff that you know. The Plan of Conservation and Development, as you know, it's a policy document. It's a guide to future development. From my perspective, this is where kind of some of my frustrations often start, is that I truly feel that this is the point in time when we should have in-depth discussions about use, you know, what land uses we want and what portion of our community, and how those uses relate to specific uses within zoning. I find too often we end up in these debates during the zoning process and not in the planning process. Also keeping in mind that too often uses that we deem acceptable and allow are based on wants what the community wants, what the community likes, but not necessarily what is market or financially feasible within the community. Simply put, land use is how land is used and the general categories for it. Zoning is our authority to regulate public health, safety, and welfare. We do this through zoning and the regulation of uses, bulk and area, and ultimately intensity of use. As I said above, kind of that idea that we typically allow uses that the community wants, and we should kind of think of them in the sense of, are they actually possible? And then our permitting processes, staff approvals versus commission approvals versus as of right uses versus conditional uses. A story I like to tell around this: years ago after Katrina, I was doing work in a suburban community in New Orleans. One of the things I was asked to do was to review their regulations to make sure the regulations weren't causing barriers to reinvestment after the destruction. And I was really puzzled by their regulations. I couldn't figure them out. I told staff, we need to talk when I get to town next week. And in that first meeting, they were like, what's up? What are your questions? I was like, let's just take something like that, Lowe's down the road, the home improvement center. I was like, what's the permitting process for that? I can't really figure out in the regs. And they're looking at me like I have three heads. And they're like, well, the applicant would come into the counter with the plans and the application, they'd pay the fee, staff would review, and within 3 to 5 business days, we'd issue a permit. And I was like, yeah, you really need to stop paying me to do this because I can't make your process any more efficient. But in Connecticut, we require almost everything to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. We don't allocate many permits other than basic things like sheds and decks to staff. And when you think of that in the market context, investment flows to the area of least resistance. And by causing everything to go through a permitting process, most of which rely on special permits and public hearings, that creates an obstacle or a barrier. In the real estate market, when we talk about uses, we refer to them more often as asset classes. So I'm going to go back and forth between use and asset class. In the context of real estate development, at the end of the day, I think we have to keep in mind that it's just an investment tool. It's no different than stocks or bonds or other means of investing people's money. You often hear complaints, often at public hearings, about, developers getting too rich and they're making too much money off of these developments. But I think we have to keep in mind that that real estate development is high risk. And I'll talk about that a bit later, in that there's so many factors influencing whether or not a development will move forward. And because of that high risk, it needs to have high returns. Market feasibility is whether or not there's enough demand in the market to support the use. And financial feasibility is whether or not the development can attract financial investment, either private equity or debt. Return on investments is the return that the development will provide. And then the idea of site selection. How do I identify a good site for certain uses? And I'll talk more about that later also. So some of my frustrations, the idea of what I refer to as unrealistic expectations. Not every community can have every use. If you think about it, I like using coffee as an example. Most communities have Dunkin' Donuts. Not all communities have Starbucks, right? And that's a market factor. Dunkin' Donuts is a lesser costly or lesser value product that appeals to a mass market, where Starbucks is a higher price product and appeals to a smaller market due to that. So things like community income, household income, factor into where a place like Starbucks will go. So how does your community ultimately match up with kind of the uses and the marketplace that you may desire? I'm going to move along. Sorry, I'm going to move along on to the next slide. Some examples of those frustrations. For me, some of these are kind of amusing. Years ago, we were doing some work in the northwestern corner of Connecticut. Very wealthy community. Definitely, from a wealth perspective, could support a Nordstrom's. From a population perspective of 1,200, they will never have a Nordstrom's. But when we asked them what they wanted their town center to be, and what they wanted in their town center, they insisted on they wanted a Nordstrom's. And that's kind of this starting point of kind of, you know, you need to match up the realities of the marketplace with ultimately what the community can bear. Most communities in this age where we kind of like mixed use, walkable, most communities often tell us they want a blueback square style development. And my response is often, well, you have to understand Blueback Square and you have to understand West Hartford. West Hartford is a wealthy community and it's a large community with 65,000 persons. Think about 65,000 persons in relationship to the size of your communities. It's twice, triple, 4 times, maybe 5 times the size of many other suburban communities in the Hartford market. Blueback is there for a reason, because the community can support it and the overall West Hartford Center is a regional draw. While we often have an aversity towards things like auto-oriented development and an aversion towards things like fast food establishments, the fact is fast food establishments and other types of retail often thrive on what's called agglomerated economies, and that means clustering. Just think about it. In many locations, the Berlin Turnpike in Newington, stand in front of McDonald's, look both directions down the road, and you can see Wendy's and you can see Burger King. They like being in eye shot of each other because you as the consumer don't have to make a decision on which one you're going to until you get there. You're drawn to that cluster. So I find it interesting when then I review regs and I find communities that put separation distance and say, you know, no 2 fast food establishments can be within a 1/4 mile or a 1/2 mile of each other. That's undermining kind of how those uses actually function. Now, if you don't want them, just don't allow them. That's perfectly fine. I'm not saying you have to allow them, but don't kind of set up your regulations in a way that they ultimately undermine them. In recent times, I'm not going through all these. In recent times, you know, we've seen an uptick in the demand for residential, especially in the demand for multifamily. And on a national level, at the same time, we've also seen a decline in retail. And on a national level, adding multifamily development to retail areas or retail sites like struggling malls has been the primary way of repositioning them. It used to be said that retail follows rooftops. That means you add more houses, you get more retail. I think now it's shifted and actually rooftops now follow retail. That is, in places where retail is struggling, infilling with residential creates a symbiotic relationship, a captive audience. The more houses you add, the more demand you have or support you have for the existing retail. So it's a way to reposition it. And I always like to say, housing is economic development. Housing is where jobs go at night. We often exclude it from the economic development side of things, but it has that relationship to it. On work I did recently, I encountered a POCD that said, you know, the residents want retail and restaurants. And that's one of those places where I perfectly understand if a community wants something. And I'm perfectly fine with the POCD stating that want. But there was no further discussion in the POCD about the overall marketplace and the saturation of market. that a large number of restaurants and retail already existed, that high vacancy rates plagued the location, that even though this is something that the community wants, it may be challenging to actually achieve. So this section I'm going to move through very quickly, just to touch on some of the asset classes and what's going on in the greater Hartford market. The retail sector, it's kind of funny as I was updating my slide deck. 4 months ago when I gave this slide deck, I had retail's on the road to recovery as my first bullet. And now I put maybe not. 2024 was actually a really good year for retail. There was more store openings than there were store closings. And the projections already for this year is that store closings are probably going to double the amount of store openings. So that changed really quickly. The office market in the Hartford region is in really kind of dire straits. CBD or downtown vacancy rates are up as high as 50%. Definitely around 40, but probably up to about 50%. Suburban vacancies are 20% or higher, depending on the location. This is an area in the marketplace where we're probably not going to see much more new construction unless it's very specific tenant built, like Hartford Healthcare building a new office building. Restaurants in some ways have recovered, but are still struggling. We still see a reduction in hours. There are still staff shortages. Local dining or mom and pop restaurants have probably been hit harder coming out of the pandemic than the nationals. And fast casual is booming. And actually, I should have added to that, drive-throughs are booming. Hotels and resorts, slow recovery. On the leisure tourism side, the recovery is good. Business travel is still a bit weak. In Connecticut and in the greater Hartford region overall, occupancies are low at about 61%, probably up around 67% pre-pandemic. And RevPAR is only at about $85 per room. Multifamily is still doing relatively strong. I keep on wondering when it's gonna slow down. I keep on thinking it needs to slow down, but definitely in Connecticut and definitely in the greater Hartford market, it is still, moving along pretty well. Some of the challenges are increase in costs on the construction side and commercial and industrial. Self-storage is probably one of the strongest asset classes for new construction, but it has to be climate controlled. And we see ebbs and flows in the world of warehousing and distribution. I know there was big demand a few years back, a lot of facilities being proposed and approved. That seems to have slowed a bit, but I would say, the demand is still out there. And as e-commerce continues to tick up, over time, we're going to still see demand out there for the logistics centers. Just some basics on average rents in the greater Hartford market for retail, office, and industrial. I'm often surprised at communities not having an understanding of the rents in their communities. I think it's really important to keep track of them. They give us an indication of how the market's doing. It's a way of taking temperature. But one of the things to understand is the average rents in our marketplace are soft compared to, we typically use $30 a square foot as a threshold. If rents are above $30 a square foot, you can probably support new construction. If they're below $30 a square foot, you probably can't. And even though the averages are always going to run lower, you could still have a $35 or $40 square foot rent with a new construction if it's in a strong location. But it's just a way of kind of understanding how the market's functioning in the relationship to new construction. Some market dynamics, kind of any presentation I give, whether it's on markets, whether it's on demographics or socioeconomics, I always like to lead off with this message of change is inevitable. Simply put, things change. As communities, we react negatively to change. You know, what we often describe as being NIMBYism, not in my backyard, I often feel is more about a fear of change. We just don't want things to change, so anything being proposed becomes disruptive. Change is neither good nor bad. It can have both desirable and undesirable outcomes. It can also produce opportunities and surprises. I think the biggest challenge we face, or one of the biggest challenges we face in planning, is not to try and stop and resist change, but to embrace it, adapt to it, and manage it. You know, just to say, if you don't want apartment buildings, you know, the fact is they're not going away. They're actually being driven by changes in demographics, which I'll talk a little bit about. And therefore, we're going to see a continued demand for them, regardless of other things going on, because our households have changed. The key drivers for real estate property markets are jobs, population, household formations, and household income. That kind of tells us what's going on. When jobs are growing, new demand is created. When population's growing, new demand is created. When household formations are increasing, demand is created. And then income kind of tells us at what price points. Some challenges with real estate. There's that, you know, age-old saying, what's the three most important things? Location, location, location. It's true, but there's a problem with it. So first we have to understand that real estate's fixed in location. Therefore, its kind of success and value are tied to what's going on around it. It's durable and long lasting. Therefore, product that was built 100 years ago, say houses, are still competing in the marketplace with houses that were built last year. It's temporal. The specific house, you know, that's being built is built for the market at that point in time. I grew up in Wethersfield. I grew up in a 1,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom, 1-car garage on a 1/4-acre lot. Perfectly fine property, but deficient in today's marketplace, where the average new house being constructed is 2,600 square feet, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms. One of the bathrooms has to be en suite with the master, because you don't want to share it with the kids. 2-car garage in a lot that's definitely bigger than a 1/4 acre. Therefore, there's this constant threat or challenge of properties, whatever they be, remaining relevant. And that's where creative destruction comes in. New products destroy products that came before them. The Walkman killed the vinyl record. The CD then killed the vinyl record and the Walkman, and the MP3 ended up killing all of them because of its portability. That's creative destruction. And then functional obsolescence. If my parents didn't continually invest in their 1950s home, it would become functionally obsolete. But they did all the improvements that needed to be updated. They did the roof, the furnace, all that stuff. And they also, you know, added a small addition. So it's no longer 1,000 square feet, it's 1,200 square feet. It still has other deficiencies, but it still has a place in the marketplace. Creative destruction. None of us are using these phones or these phones anymore. They've been destroyed by these, especially the pay telephone. I can't even think of the last time I saw one or where it is, because there's no need. We all now have portable phones with us. When I talked about location, 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 peak value location of retail in 1950s Greater Hartford was Main Street, downtown, G-Fox. Best location in the world. Worst location today. So yes, location, 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 but location changes. In 1974, the location for retail became West Farms Mall. In 2007, it became Blueback Square. The location is constantly changing, and prior locations can be left struggling. Just a little bit of data. When I talk about changing household structure, let's start on this left-hand side. This is households by type, 1970 to 2012. 40% of households were married couples with children in 1970, 19.6% in 2012, 19% today. Half of the households that were married couples with children have gone away. That's a tremendous change. Look at the number of persons per household. Single person households have increased, 2 persons have increased, and then 3, 4, 5 or more households have all decreased. That's why we're seeing it's the increase in 1 and 2 person households. It's the decrease in households with children that are driving the rental market and the apartment market. At the same time, it changes how we function as consumers. Look at in 1970. This is food outside the home, eating out, food at home, so groceries, versus food outside the home, eating out at a restaurant. They finally crossed in around 2015, and now we consume more food outside the home than we do outside the home. More food outside the home than we do inside the home. Look at the industry sales for restaurants from 1970 to 2017. It's a 20-fold increase. That's this shift. My mom was a stay-at-home mom in the 1970s, cooking 3 meals a day in the house, sending us off to work and lunch with our, brown bag sandwiches and so forth. As our household structure has changed, our consumer behavior has changed, and it changes the way we exist. So some of those demographics: Connecticut, 2010 to 2020, 1% population increase. That's statistically kind of flat population. Harford County mirrored it, and we did better than some other places, poorer than Fairfield County. Jump over here to adult population. Connecticut increased adult population by 4%, Harford County by 3%. That's a sign that we are aging. And then when we go and we look at the under 18 population, Connecticut down 10%, Harford County down 9%. Older adult population is increasing, younger population is decreasing, and that's an aging population. So our population overall as a demand driver has been mostly stagnant. Look at job growth in Connecticut. From 1985 to 1989, we added 100,000 plus jobs in just 5 years. From 1990 to 2020, a 30-year period, we added 45,000. So those 2 key demand drivers, jobs and population, have been mostly stagnant in recent times, limiting the amount of demand that there is out there. That directly relates to vacancies that we're seeing out there, say in the retail sector or other aspects of the commercial sector. We used to build a lot of housing when we had strong population growth, and we used to build a lot of multifamily housing up here in the green. The 70s were a weak economy period. The 80s had that housing boom, as we see here. Still a fair share, maybe 25% or 20% multifamily. Look what happens after 1990. We decline and flatline. Look what happens after 2008 and 9, and where we are up to 2018. And this basically stays the same up until today. We are building far less housing than we built previously because our population is mostly stagnant. But for me, the biggest concern is over the past 30 years, we've built very little multifamily. And there's an uptick now, we're building more of it. But in some ways, not only do we have a shifting population that's demanding more multifamily, we actually have an existing multifamily stock that's over 30 years old and isn't really compatible in the market. So the consumer is willing to pay top dollar for a modern, high quality rental versus something that was built in the 1980s or 1970s. And that's part of what's going on in the marketplace. Just a quick look at age pyramids. This is a town outside of the CROG region. This is actually in Middlesex County. But here's their 2010 age pyramid. and look at their contraction of what was Gen X and a little bit of millennials, how few 30-something and 20-something-year-olds were in that community. When you skip ahead to 2030 or 2023, this population is producing this very small amount of school-age children. Skip ahead to here, the 2023 now compared to a 2028 projection, and we're still seeing the contraction here in the middle. Oh, sorry. In the 20s and 30s, that's child producing years, and you're seeing a continued contraction on the lower end. You also see that our baby boomers up here, our population's becoming top heavy. Many, if not most, communities in Connecticut look similar to this. This one's a bit more exaggerated, but it shows that kind of changing population structure. We're aging up top and we're contracting down the bottom. When looking into markets and trying to identify sites in the real estate world, we talk about site selection. And it's a really lengthy process that, say, a retailer goes through, whether it be Target or whether it be Starbucks, let's say. This lengthy process of trying to identify what is the best site, the best location to invest in at this point in time. Things like visibility and accessibility, regional exposure, and then key market indicators that all get funneled into kind of making that decision on a good site. This is just a recent exercise that we did, a section of Route 66 in Middlefield, Connecticut. We put a geofence on it, which captures cell phone pings, and then looked at where is every cell phone's home location in comparison to that corridor. And that gives us an idea of what the trade area is. Where are people coming from to go to this strip location? That's part of this kind of how do we understand how a certain corridor location is functioning, and how can we make decisions about what are maybe some of the best uses at that location. To bring this more into planning, I know communities are often frustrated, and when I've sat on the municipal side and when I advise municipalities, I share the frustration even today of that a developer comes forward with a very well-developed plan before they even get to us. And then there's this feeling of we can't make changes because it's so far along. In some ways, that's true. This process, steps 1 through 6, have probably taken a year to 2 years before an application becomes known to you as a planning and zoning commission. It's maybe at this stage as they're getting into design and then the land use stage. And then even if it gets approved after going through your process, you're still probably looking at a 2 to 3 year period to actually finish the construction of it. I have another slide that's going to come back to that in a different way after this one. When talking about financial feasibility and market feasibility, this is a very basic back of the envelope calculation that I probably do on a weekly basis to determine whether or not it's plausible for a certain type of use to exist in a certain location. So what's the market rent in the location that maybe the community is thinking about? In this case, $25 a square feet. Total construction cost, including land, this is all in everything. Estimating for retail, $245 a square foot. Multiply that by the 50,000 square foot building for $12 million. Divide that by 7 years, because that's the typical kind of financial horizon. Sometimes it's 8, sometimes it's 9. It could stretch to 10, depending on what the investors are looking for, but it's typically 7 years. And that's 1.7 million a year. Divide that then by the 50,000 square foot building, and it tells you you need probably at a minimum $35 a square foot to actually have that use work. So do the rents justify the investment? No. The market rents were $25. The required rent is $35, and it probably doesn't work. Now, it may not be dead in the water right at that point, but that starts us being able to look at, is it plausible? Is it feasible to actually start considering this kind of use or this kind of construction in this location? So this is my taking that steps in the development process, laying it out in the timeline at year one, showing where the developer has arrived at the land use permitting process, and then on to construction. It's not just about all the time that's gone into getting there. It's about the money that's probably been spent up front. So a meaningful development, let's say, I don't know, a Target or a Home Depot, they're probably 200 grand to $250,000 in by the time they get to you. It's one of the reasons why they get really upset when they get denied. It's a big loss. This is where I truly think flexible zoning techniques like master plan approaches that allow them to come in with a master plan, not full-blown site plan and traffic studies and all that, can lower some of the risk to get to a point with the community where the community can say no up front on that master plan, and the developer hasn't laid out all of that site design stuff, the really expensive stuff, by the time they get there. Jacob asked a question this morning on the planner's listserv about parking, or it was yesterday afternoon. And it's just funny. This was already in my slide deck, but I just want to touch on it a little bit. For a private client, I was asked a few years ago to look at parking in West Hartford Center and demand for parking and where the demand was and so forth. And we did some geofence analysis. And this is one of those moments where I was truly surprised by what I thought. West Hartford Center is one of those walkable places. It's one of those places where we think about sidewalks and people and outdoor dining, and that it should be pedestrian friendly and not automobile friendly. And West Hartford has debated this a lot, even recently. But the most interesting thing we found with geofencing was the most common visitor to West Hartford Center is only there for 15 to 29 minutes. It's the person running in the Starbucks. It's the person running into the pharmacy. It's the person dropping off something to be framed at the frame shop and then picking it up that are actually the most frequent visitors to the center. This is not me pitching cars as, good or parking's a must, but it does show to us the importance of that quick and convenient parking. And in West Hartford Center, that's ultimately the on-street parking component, not the back lots, not the parking garages. But we're able to see the ebb and flow over the course of the day when the center is the busiest, and over the course of the week, Friday and Saturday being the busiest days, not surprisingly. My doctoral dissertation studied West Hartford Center. This was totally separate, but just a way to think about retail in general. Over a 17-year period, 10.6% of storefronts turned over each year. That was kind of the average over that period. And that's what we find actually in shopping malls and strip plazas. You see about 10% turnover per year. Some years were really low, 3.3%. Some were really high because Blueback was added at 30%. But the more interesting thing was 25% of the storefronts were actually constant over that time. So you can have a lot of stability and a lot of churn going on simultaneously. And I think that kind of signals a healthy location. If the vacancies just stayed high for a long time, then you wouldn't have churn. And if everything was turning over, say 20% of storefronts per year, then you wouldn't have that stability. So just kind of a way of thinking about turnover is good, provided that there's also stability. At planning and zoning commissions, we often talk about trip generation, right, when reviewing the application, but we talk less about average daily traffic counts. And in transportation planning at CROG and in site selection in the commercial real estate, especially retail industry, daily traffic counts are really important. They tell us a lot. And this was part of a project we're doing in Bloomfield, comparing the Winterberry Mall in Bloomfield Center to the Capaco Mall out on Cottage Grove Road. And look at the difference in traffic counts. You know, right in front of Winterberry Mall in the center, 5,000. The best counts around it, 7,000. Compared to the main arterial that brings people in and out of a place like Cigna with 12 and 13,000 traffic counts a day. It explains a lot about this. Total visitors to Capaco, total visitors to Winterberry, 10,000 a day to Capaco, 2,000 a day to Winterberry. Traffic matters, traffic counts matter. If you can't hit that threshold of, you know, decent traffic counts, then a commercial location is likely going to struggle. So a few just examples of another example of a community, and Heidi might be familiar with this. This community years ago wanted to try and attract someone like a Panera to a pad site on a plaza. It was actually a great location, but the traffic counts were weak, and I kind of felt like that was the key barrier. And there was also prohibitions or strict restrictions on drive-throughs. And the fact is, and I went through this in Old Saybrook last year, the fact is, in this day and age, you're not going to attract a Panera or a Starbucks without a drive-through. It can be 60 to 80% of the storefront business, and they're all heading in that direction. So over time, though, ultimately some regulation changes were made. Multifamily was approved behind the Strip Plaza, so there was going to be 260 new housing units. And then look at that, the approval. The traffic counts still remain weak. They're just below the thresholds that are desirable, but allowing for the drive-through and adding the housing on site, so everyone going in and out of that housing is going to have to pass the pad site with the Starbucks, makes a world of difference in the way that site is actually viewed. Starbucks actually right now, if you haven't noticed, there's a lot of new storefronts opening up. There's one out by Costco in New Britain. There's another one on South Main Street in West Hartford. I know there's some other ones out there that I can't think of right now. But they're also going in close proximity to existing Starbucks storefronts that don't have drive-throughs. And the fact is, Starbucks is cannibalizing its own stores intentionally. They will get the new stores up and running, and they will close the stores that don't have drive-throughs because they realize the importance of the drive-through in their business model. So some basic conclusions here. Sorry that I ran a little longer than intended. Embrace and manage change. Consider market, site selection, feasibility when you're doing your planning. Be realistic of what your community wants and what your community can support, and work within a market framework when creating and amending your zoning. And Jacob, if you want to allow, I'll gladly take some questions if there's time.
Yeah, absolutely. You did perfectly fine. We wanted you to get through anything you wanted to, so no problem with time. If anyone has any questions for Don, feel free to speak out now or raise your hand or
Something in the chat.
Yeah.
I want to give first dibs to, we got question. Oh, just confirming the Starbucks. While folks are maybe thinking, I want to say, well, first, apologies, Don. I feel like I shortchanged your intro. I think in part because I'm very familiar with you and your work, and I think I jokingly refer to myself a little bit as a groupie, I think, just because I like your presentation so much. And I think for me, the combination of sort of your, you know, combining the data with sort of the experience that we're seeing on the ground, and also just your honesty about how, you know, sort of the market realities work. So one of the things, well, first, when I'd seen this presentation 4 months ago, I think, as you mentioned, and so immediately it was one that I wanted to be able to share with our PC. So really glad to have you. And I wanted to ask a question, and it kind of ties in a little bit, I think, with, we were recently hearing from Mike Goman, the founder of Goman in New York, who was sort of talking about, you know, partly Goman in New York was created because, you know, they saw value in sort of creating this firm as sort of this go-between, or a translator, if you will, sort of between, you know, planners and commissioners and decision makers and the development community. And so I think related to this, one of the questions I might have is, can you speak to, for lack of a better word, I want to say, maybe the distrust that exists between, you're laughing, sort of between, you know, even, you know, concerned citizens or commissioners and developers, and, you know, a little bit, you know, does that ring true for you? And why do we think that is? And even more so, what would your advice be to commissioners on the line here, sort of like, what can they do to inform or arm themselves to know, you know, when they can trust or when they should question? Kind of threw a lot in there, but.
Yeah, the distrust is really unfortunate, and it's real. You can't avoid it. Even within the planning profession, just forget about the public response and so forth in the commissions. I remember years ago, earlier on in my career, when I started doing work for developers, you know, I had planners asking me why I went to the dark side. I remember another conversation with a planner where they just looked at me like I had three heads, and they're like, "What? We're supposed to let the market solve it?" And in that context, that's not what I was saying. So I'm not all about like it's market or nothing, but I think at the end of the day, planning has occurred in a vacuum, void of market. And I think whether it be planners, whether it be commissioners, or whether it be the public, you need to understand things like, you know, most of your home builders are your local residents. You know, they're the local guy with kids in the school trying to make a living. And yeah, when they say, you know, when you hear that the minimum returns need to be 12%, it's not because, you know, they're being greedy. It's because of the fact that they could sink $200,000 into plans to get denied by you. And then that 200 grand has to be absorbed into the other projects that they do. Or it could be that they sink 200 grand in, they get their proposals, but it was a year and a half coming through they get their approvals, but it was a year and a half coming through the approval process without litigation. And then the market tanked. So, you know, they just got their approvals in 2007, and then the market tanks in 2008. There's so much risk involved that's why the returns have to be high. It's not about greed, because someone else, an equity investor, if they have $1 million to invest, they can drop it in a mutual fund for 6 or 7% with far less risk. So why are you going to go for the real estate development that's so risky? Because you can get a higher return, but with a ton of risk there. So I just think we all need to be kind of more open to this big picture and recognize that zoning and markets work together. And that if you actually learn a little bit about each from either side, you can actually have them work better than they do now, when it's just this, either we ignore the market because it's Darth Vader and the dark side and bad, or, you know, we figure out a way to actually work within that context. And oh, by the way, I like short introductions, so you were fine. You didn't jump in.
It was short, like no introduction, but we just wanted to jump right in. And so I think Elizabeth has her hand raised.
Hi there. Thank you very much. It's great to have you here. This presentation was fantastic and very timely. At my commission in Canton, Connecticut, we were just talking about retail at our last meeting. And our EDA came in and presented results of a survey. And so we were talking about exactly this, the community wants versus market demands. You presented a slide about square feet per person at the beginning of the presentation by
Yeah.
country. And then you were talking about how in the United States it was slowing down. I haven't been able or haven't really looked for data like that. And I thought it was very interesting. I wondered whether you were able to glean any insight from it.
Yeah, well, one is if you want, send me an email. I can probably share some data with you. Number two is in America, I mean, we kind of supersize everything. Our cars are big, our houses are big, our lots are big, our stores are big. So we build more retail than anyone else. There has been a trend in some areas to kind of scale back in size. But, also with that slide, I didn't focus in on it, but Mike Goman, I have this quote I've been using for him by years, is that retail is not so much overbuilt, it's that it's under demolished. And our use of that line is really about the fact that there's a lot of crappy 1950s, 60s, and 70s retail product that still lingers out there that has high vacancy rates that kind of drags the market down. Then you throw in on top of that, the collapse of the regional malls and those vacancies. In some ways, many of those regional malls, they just need to be pushed over. They need to go. They don't need to come back as retail, or they only need 10% of the retail to come back. So it's not that we're overbuilt, we're under demolished, but yeah, we've built a lot more of it than anyone else. So.
Thank you.
Sure. Tom, you got your hand raised.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, but it focused on private developers. Have you done any studies about planning for the development of public facilities?
Meaning town halls, libraries, or
yeah. So the reason that I ask that is that in Bolton, we built a new high school. And we said, oh, we're going to get the surrounding towns to pay for it by bringing in kids. And right now we haven't paid the bond off and we're talking about closing the high school because there's not enough kids. And what happened was the community wanted this thing. So they persuaded themselves that it was good.
Yeah.
And it wasn't.
Right. How long ago was it built? I'm just curious.
About 15 years ago.
Yeah. So a couple things here. Yeah, we've done a lot of work on this stuff. We've helped Manchester with some library planning, Bloomfield library and community centers and so forth. The public infrastructure investments, whether it be a library, whether it be a school, it's a different creature than normal real estate because at the end of the day, you're building a public good. You're not building an investment, mechanism. That being said, there's a lot of similarities to it. One of the unfortunate things I would say is 15 years ago, it still looked like our school age populations were trending upwards and then they tanked. So there is a lot of overbuilt schools out there in certain communities from that era, probably 20 to 15 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, that now the schools have seen tremendous declines in their enrollment. And that's the demographic stuff going on, the shrinking households, the decline in, married couples with children and so forth. So it becomes really challenging. The other thing, and this is where I'm a little more timid, but I'm going to kind of say it anyways. At the end of the day, one is you're always going to have to build new schools, even if your population's stagnant, because at some point that school building is going to be 50 years old and you're going to need a new one, right? So there is this you do have to accept the fact that you're going to spend money building new facilities at times, or at least doing substantial renovations if you want to stay, relatively competitive. Number two is that once you get into the construction on a public facility, I think whether it's a school, a community center, or a library, there is this kind of push. Well, we're already in for tens of millions of dollars. We might as well make it as state of art as possible. And therefore you see inflated budgets. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's a tough thing for the taxpayer to kind of grasp, you know, and deal with. But yeah, it's challenging. And I'd say it's no different than the private market. You know, someone could have built a new office building 15 years ago and now it's totally vacant and they can't find a tenant for it. So a municipality in some ways in no different position than many developers. And it's because we can't see the future. So hope that helps. I know probably not the perfect answer, but
Thank you.
We've got a question in the chat, Don, this is in line with one of the questions that I had. And the question is, how can we reach sustainable development goals in the context of a growth-based economy?
Yeah, good question. I'd start with one, how are we defining sustainable development goals? One is I like going back to the Venn diagram, and it's a balance between economics, social, and environmental. And that balance ultimately means that at times, you know, you're trying to find the balance between the three. And for the economic to occur, at times you're going to sacrifice environment, right? Or vice versa. And if you're trying to achieve environment, you're going to sacrifice economic. I'm just leaving social off to the side. I'm not forgetting about it. So we're in that constant struggle of balance. It's not ideal. So an ideal world, if we wanted to be sustainable, would have, you know, no more growth. Theoretically, no more greenfield development and so forth. My feeling is this: we need to find a way to, and this isn't me promoting smart growth, because those who have known me a long time, I'm not a big fan of that. But we need to find a way to allow more infill development or redevelopment of existing areas. And this is where, and I'm not picking on anyone specifically, but I'm gonna pick on Wethersfield in this case because I grew up there. Wethersfield, like any other community, you know, you have a road like the Silestein Highway. It's suburban strip. Many of us in the planning profession may think that's awful and so forth, but it's actually a really good commercial corridor that means a lot to the community and provides what it needs. But it's also got a lot of crappy 1950s, 60s, and 70s era commercial development that could benefit from redevelopment and updating, modernization, so forth and so on. I think we really need to work to find ways to allow investment to flow to those properties. And part of that is a more predictable and flexible zoning approach that makes it easy for those properties to redevelop. The more we can do that, the more we can infill, the more we can, let's say, add apartments to the Buckland Hills Mall site or the Enfield Square Mall site and find new things. The more we can redevelop of existing, the less strain we're going to put on, you know, the green fields and the outer more rural places. But at the end of the day, you have to remember, redeveloping adds additional costs. A greenfield doesn't have demolition costs. Demolition can be $10 to $20 a square foot. Do the math. If you have a 20,000 square foot building, or let's say you have a 1 million square foot mall, and it's going to cost you $20 a square foot to push it over, well, that's $20 million just to knock it down. And you have to work that into the development pro forma to build something in its place now. So we need to find ways to make it easier to redevelop that which we already have. So.
Thank you. I think that's time.
I
Yeah.
think so too.
Thanks so much, Don. Appreciate you coming and doing this. That was a killer presentation. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat, and we'll be sure to pass them along. If anything else. And with that, Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'd gladly do some additional answers via email out of the chat to you. And I believe I resent the slide deck to you, Jacob. So hopefully you have it now and you can share it with them if they want it.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
guys.
much.
Appreciate you. All right, with that, I am going to reshare the screen, and I believe we have a presentation by CROG. Let's see, can everyone see that okay? Okay, cool.
I can say,
Perfect.
so we have market forces impact.
Oh,
Oh,
no,
we did that already.
yeah,
sorry.
we're on the next.
I can follow up that presentation.
Drinking water protection and local land use. Best practices for public water supply protection.
And Heidi and Sonia are going to be presenting this one. Do you want to switch seats? And
I'm good
Okay.
here.
Sounds good.
Good evening, Heidi Samoker, Principal Planner here at CROG.
Good evening, everyone. This is Sonia Carrizales, Environmental Planner at CROG.
So that was a tough act to follow. We will be brief about this. We wanted to alert you about this study that was done by a different COG, the Western Connecticut Council of Governments down in the western part of the state. So what we want to do is just give you a brief overview of what their report is, and then just orient you to parts of it you might want to go look at to see if it's relevant for your community. Next. So this study looked at the risk to our drinking water supply based on a series by analyzing spill data from the state, and then also recognizing the lack of protection for this land. So if you look at this map here, the areas in yellowish orange, those are the public water supply watersheds in the region. So generally that's land that drains to, or the tributaries that feed into public drinking water supplies. If you look at the report, which you can find on their website, and the presentation also has a link to it. If you look at their report, they add a little bit more nuance to the public water supply watersheds, but we would be here pretty much till midnight if I got into that nuance. What isn't covered by the report, but what many of you are probably familiar with, are those blue hashed areas. Those are the aquifer protection areas that I believe around 10 or 15 years ago, the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection mapped. And once they mapped it, communities had to go and adopt zoning regulations to protect their aquifers. So again, this report focuses on the orangey yellow areas, but I think what the report talks about is also helpful for your aquifer protection areas. Next slide. So there are two highlights we wanted to mention, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the tools in this report. It was interesting that 80% of the land in a public water supply watershed is privately owned. Water companies generally only own about 20%. Why is that important? If it's privately owned, the only protection is through town regulation. So if you have if you are in that orange or yellow area and you don't have protection measures, then that could lead your drinking water supplies to be vulnerable. The second interesting thing in the report is Connecticut is the only New England state where the state doesn't have riparian buffer requirements. So a riparian buffer runs along streams and rivers, and it's an area to be protected. It's different from the upland review area that your Wetlands Commission regulates, because activities aren't necessarily prohibited in an upland review area where they could be in a riparian buffer. So this report really looks at three different things in its watershed protection zoning toolbox: land use-based activities, or based controls, activity-based controls, and review-based controls. So number one is completely within your wheelhouse. You decide what land uses are allowed in each zone. Activity-based may or may not be within your purview. For example, an activity is spraying pesticides. That's not necessarily attributed to a certain land use. So it's a little questionable which activities you can or can't restrict within zoning. And then the third item is review-based controls. As many of you know, if a application comes in for a parcel that is located within one of those orange or yellow areas, it gets referred to the water company so they have a chance to do a review and point out any concerns. Now, the report sets forth 10 overall strategies, and we highlighted in teal those which are most relevant for the work that you do, about making sure you have setbacks to keep potentially harmful uses further away from water courses and aquifers. The riparian buffers we just talked about, overlay zones, impervious coverage limits, and so forth. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to point to you a few additional resources you may find helpful in the report.
Thank you, Heidi. So first I wanted to point out the Appendix 4A, which is land uses with pollution potential. Essentially what this is it's a table that compares land use activities and their associated groundwater or surface water impacts across various New England states. The data being predominantly from Massachusetts, Maine, and Rhode Island. And we thought this would be a helpful resource because it could assist with determining restrictions or limitations on inappropriate land uses. And there's hundreds of diverse development types in this table. It's like 3 or 4 pages. So a lot of information there, but it could be helpful for that. And then going to the next slide, we wanted to point out Appendix 13, which is a zoning commission's checklist for watershed protection. It might be overwhelming to look at first since there's a lot of information here, but it outlines a 6-step process for watershed protection that zoning commissions can use as a jumping off point. So throughout this process, there are, you're able to kind of tailor and meet your unique community's needs through this checklist. So we wanted to highlight that as well. And then going to the last slide, we have Appendix 14, which is a watershed management stormwater screening matrix, and it provides a high-level overview of various stormwater management options, and it's focused on nature-based solutions, as you can see in the bottom half of the appendix or the table. And this is relevant for zoning commissions that are looking to include stormwater regulations or nature-based solutions and local zoning regulations, since each of the strategies show efficacy for reducing pollutants in rivers and streams or reducing the risk of downstream flooding. And that was our last slide. Thank you.
Oops, I'm going too far, sorry. Let's get back. All right, and with all this, I can send over this specific resource along with Don's presentation in an email following up tomorrow. So anything that's hard to read, you'll be able to dive in yourself and expand the view.
And as Heidi said, this was the work of another COG, and Heidi and Sonia, you know, wandered into that report. I think it's pretty lengthy and gave you sort of, I think, a high level you know, synopsis and tried to point out some stuff. So I would offer, if anybody does have questions, to feel free to ask them, but we may or may not have answers for you tonight, but we could always go try to find that for you as well. But so I'll pause for questions if anybody has any for Heidi or Sonia. Okay.
All right, looking good. We'll keep going. We have the 5th item on the agenda. If you want, go for it.
The report of the zoning and subdivision referral.
So not too much to report on this week. We have one. I'm just going to need a little bit more time to review, but to give you a heads up, it's going to be a request for a Tilcon quarry expansion. Yeah, I'm going to take my time with that one. So that will be coming out next round. But to go through these, nothing that I saw as needing any further comment. We have in Granby, just some housekeeping stuff. They are looking to, I believe it was consolidation of regs, Bolton, housekeeping language situation, nothing much there. Newington was introducing regulations to figure out where, or to show where the placement of alternative energy structures, specifically for EVs and things like that, should be going. Enfield had a text amendment regarding liquor permits for 2 zones specifically. And then Marlborough had text amendments regarding their residential zone regulations and winery retail stores. I won't be responding for this probably in the next batch just because of town letters, just because I'm waiting for clarification from their town planner on if the residential zone regulations are actually up for review. The referral was a bit ambiguous, so nothing much there, nothing that flagged my radar for regional precedent or significance. So and that's pretty much it. That's what we have in the docs at the moment. Anything else of note for zoning reviews? I don't believe anything else has come through today, so just keep an eye out for that Tilcon one, and let me know if you have any comments. We'll probably pose a comment ourselves on that after reviewing, but you'll see it come in later. And that's that. On to the next.
Okay, moving on to RPC elections, roles and responsibilities. We've got officer responsibilities, chair and vice chair. Coordinate with CROG staff to discuss meeting agendas and develop other relevant material and oversee quarterly and special meetings. All notices of interest.
Caitlin will give a brief presentation on this just to kind of update you on the process and let you know where we're going.
Sure, if that's all right. Presentation is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. You're right. You're hyping me up. So just because we do have, a fair number of commissioners, I think, since the last time, which is excellent. So some of you are more or less familiar with this. So as Jennifer said, kind of went through the officer responsibilities, and if there's anything that you want to add, you or Bill, sort of on your experiences in being an officer, but I would say in general, fairly low commitment, other than, otherwise coming to these meetings. I would say historically a max of 1 to 2, maybe 2 feels generous, hours over the span of a year. As you're probably familiar, we sort of talked about this at our last meeting. We were looking for volunteers for our nominating committee. We did not get any volunteers, so that's okay. I recognize everybody's really busy. So instead, in order to still have our vote, what we're gonna do is, the requirement was to send notice of interest to the nominating committee. So instead, we're just gonna have everyone who's interested in running potentially for either chair and or vice chair to send your notice of interest to Jacob. Right now, we're just saying prior to June 5th, which is our next meeting. We might set a deadline more like June 1, just so that we can kind of gather together all of the information. And technically, as you'll see there, staff will review attendance records. I'll touch on that more in a second. But the notice of interest just, it says per the bylaws, to summarize your background, think of it like a bio about yourself, and your interest in the position or positions. And then, as it says there, instead of the nominating committee, staff will review attendance records and the interest in the office. The bylaws then go on to state that the nominating committee would present the slate. I honestly don't know. We've never had so many that, we've eliminated anybody that's been interested to present a smaller slate of candidates. So really, we'll review the attendance records and, make sure people have been to a meeting before. But otherwise, I think what we would expect to do is, come June, anyone who is interested, we would essentially ask you to summarize what you send to us, your background and your interest, to other members of our PC, and then we would plan to vote during the June meeting. And just a point of logistics, officers, if there are new officers, they are seated at the technically conclusion of the June meeting. So it would actually be for our next meeting, which I believe is September. September. So just a point of logistic there. But any questions, or like I said, Jen or Bill, anything you want to add about your experience, please feel free.
Alright, so looking good.
Thanks, Caitlin.
So till next time in June, that's when it'll happen. Alright,
So what's new in my town? I can speak for Plainville in that we are now starting to get planned development district interest within our town. We've had our first one come before us in a pre-concept meeting. So it's, interesting to look back at our plan of conservation and development and where we originally thought would be most appropriate to have PDDs. And we have made some revisions to our regulations to accommodate a couple of other areas based on interest, where we find it will be appropriate, like up in our technology park zone, where we've had a real difficult time with it as a technology park zone to get businesses to come up there and develop. And that's the section where we abut New Britain. And we have had some development up there, but one of the other issues is always the cost and the time to bring up all the utilities to meet some, difficult terrain up there. That's pretty much it for Plainville.
thank you.
Who would like to go next?
I was gonna ask you, Jen, I'm sorry, what kind of development are you hoping to get up there in that area?
It's a planned development district.
Mhm.
And so they were looking to do a combination up by the cancer center that would have different types of residential, more of a high-end residential on one chunk, more on a potentially some affordable housing and more workforce housing closer towards the cancer center. And then different kinds of businesses that would be on two other chunks. So it would be a proposed staged development up there in terms of which chunks are going to do when and to what degree.
Okay, I'm not super familiar with our programs yet, but the EDA has public infrastructure grants available related to sort of high quality jobs. And we have our new economic development coordinator, and we have hired her purposefully to sort of help make a connection. We are an economic development district, an EDD, and high ratio of EDA funds go to EDDs. So we're hoping to take advantage of that. So that's potentially something I'll connect you with, Kim.
Yeah, if you could, that would be great, because our town planner's last day is the 13th of March. And so I'm not sure, they're in the hiring process. I think they were extending an offer to a new town planner. We do have an assistant, but he's pretty green. So if you could send that to me in the interim, and then I'll make sure I forward it to our new town planner. That'd be great.
All right, I think we have Tom next from Bolton, if you wanted to shoot.
Thank you. We have been in the process of codifying both our subdivision regulations and our zoning regulations. And now we're starting to use that simpler organization system to start refining them and making them a little bit easier to use. And so we're doing the first two things we're doing is one, a case came to us of a firefighter who lived he's a firefighter in Bolton. He lived and he lives in town, and he and his wife had twins, and they needed to expand their house, but it was over the setback line on one side, and it was going to cost them a lot of money to have a survey and go to the zoning board of appeals. And so we looked at the whole issue of what do we regard as an impermissible expansion of a non-conforming property. And we decided that it would be all right to expand upward as long as it was a permitted use in the zone, to expand upward to the height that was permitted in that zone. And that's going to save him. It's going to save him a lot of money, and let him build. And it's also going to enable other property owners who'd like to expand upward to do so. So that's one thing. Another is that I think it was back in 2008, the state was offering grants for incentive housing zones, and so we took the grant money and rewrote our regulations around that. And then when the time came to go after the grant that would actually get the housing built, the state cut off the money. And one of the provisions that we had put in was that we didn't want just more housing, we wanted more business. And so we were requiring business on the first floor and apartments on the second floor that were above. And what it meant was that no apartments got built and also no businesses got built because nobody wanted to put in the apartments. So we're going to be taking that out of the regulations and going more closely, as Don talked about, with closer to market.
Thanks for sharing, Tom. I think next we have Matt from Farmington. Matthew?
Good evening. Two things. Farmington recently rolled out some code for food trucks. We've went through several towns' rules and figured out the best kind of fit for Farmington. So we rolled that out. Additionally, we're happy to say that we approved the Batterson Park Batterson Park Pond passive park. That's owned by the city of Hartford and it's going to be managed by the Riverfront Recapture. So they do pretty phenomenal work with all the items they manage. So that's what's new in our town.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
That's fantastic. I know Batterson has been a topic of conversation for many years, so congrats.
Next we have Chris.
Thank you. So we have a new planner in Wethersfield. Also just excited to meet everybody and be here. I started on our planning and zoning last June or July, so I'm fairly new myself, but we have a new planner, David Elder. He was with the Department of Transportation for about 10 years, I think. And so we're really grateful to have him. It took a really long time to get a new planner in Wethersfield. So we're a little bit behind on some of the updates to our zoning. There's some language, some conforming changes that are kind of to align with state statute, and getting our affordable housing plan in, and working on our plan of C&D right now. And although I know Don, talked about our aging retail, but I would like to say that most of our retail is actually currently full or in the works to be filled. And so we have a lot going on the side of the scene. We're very excited about Raising Cane's and 2 new niche grocery stores, and just a lot of really awesome stuff going on. So again, really, really great to meet everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's exciting.
I'll add too, we managed to, several folks at CROG met with Dave Elder and the consultants, I believe, that are working on the POCD. So that was a good meeting and offering that up for any towns that are interested that just want to kind of chat in advance of going down the POCD road. And so yeah, I geeked out because I'm a Wethersfield resident myself. So that's good. Elizabeth, I think you're next.
Yeah, hi there. Canton is a town that's served by both septic and well at private homes, and then also by sewer and public water in parts of town. And we are no longer able to issue permits for properties that are served by sewer and public water at the moment, by sewer in particular. Our sewer system is aging, and there was infiltration, rainwater into the sewer system. And so there is probing that's scheduled now that things are warming up to try to repair the sewer lines so that there can be capacity again to take on new permits. So it's really, we don't know what projects aren't coming to the commission right now, but it certainly has been pretty stunning that's the situation we're in. We've made big strides in implementing our affordable housing plan, and we've seen affordable housing projects and also just multifamily projects proposed and approved. But we're very eager to fix that. And I don't know if other communities are dealing with the same thing right now, but it's been pretty jarring.
Thanks for sharing. That stinks. I don't know. Good luck, but you guys have been doing incredible work with housing, and I know you emailed interest about parking and parking reform, so soon to come June. That'll be exciting. And next we have the next Chris, or another Chris.
Hey, good evening. Yes, Chris D'Antonio, Enfield, Planning and Zoning. So most recently, I would say the most notable zoning update would be us allowing formalizing regulation for farm worker housing. So that's rather dense. I mean, it's rather unique housing, rather dense, based on proportional to acreage of farms. So we were planning to make our we're in the middle of our zoning regulation updates now. We were planning to do a new section dedicated to agriculture and being more farm friendly. Our town is a mix. We're pretty built up, but we also have a pretty wide agricultural land and uses. So this was a large farm, large farming family. They have many properties in town. They wanted to bring in new farm workers, so and they didn't want to wait for our regulations to get finished. So that's most recent. So that was nice to see. Yeah, we're in the last few chapters. We're going chapter by chapter with Don actually to do our zoning regs. So there's a lot of simplification. Don's helped us simplify our use tables, expanding uses, being a little more consistent. For example, within the industrial zones, kind of if it's enabled in one industrial zone, generally make it more applicable in the others. We have a couple industrial zones. Just decreasing the number of uses and just simplifying language. Not necessarily decreasing the number of uses, but decreasing the number of items on the table, just to simplify, consolidate. I mean, as far as housing goes, we're looking at the commission is pretty open to expanding duplexes. Duplexes are technically permissible, but we have very, very restrictive permissions on them, but making those more widely applicable in most residential zones. And we've not yet tackled ADUs. We opted out a couple of years ago from the state statute with the idea that we would come up with our own. So our time's finally come. That's probably going to be something we'll talk about at our next workshop or two with Don. Right now, we don't allow anything besides like the bare minimum of state statute for like elderly family members, really. So yeah, so there's a lot of potential there. We're obviously not going to go as far as the most recent state, what was it, 21, 29, I think, that kind of enabled them statewide. So it's definitely not the appetite to quite go that far, but hopefully we'll at least get apartment, like maybe like a basement apartments, probably not extra units on the land if I had to, read the room, but I think we'll be able to come up with some sort of compromise. And so looking forward to that.
Exciting. Thanks for sharing. I will say when I saw the farm or the housing on farmland regulation come through, I thought it was like the coolest thing since sliced bread. So I did some work a while ago with new farmers or starting up farmers, and that was a big barrier that they were saying a lot of farmers who had the land but were too old to activate it or things like that. A big barrier for those folks to reactivate their land, or new starter farmers to get on land. They might be able to afford the crop space, but not the housing in the area. So that's huge. Cool to see it.
Well, yeah, apparently it's kind of required actually. So again, it's a rather large farming family that that came to us with it. So they explained it was pretty interesting actually. But they need to provide housing as part of a federal program to get to kind of expand their workforce. I forget exactly where they said a lot of their workers come from, but they come from Central America, and they're seasonal employees. So they're actually required. So in order to expand their workforce, at least using migrant labor,
Yeah.
they need to provide the housing. So yeah, that was pretty new to me.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'll also just a quick throw in there just because Don mentioned it with the Enfield Mall. We did actually have a very early conceptual presentation from them. I think it was like 2 or 3 months ago now. And yeah, so we got an early look at that, and probably part of our zoning regulation updates will include Don is a big proponent of special design districts. So we're likely going to make our special design district um, regulations more flexible, more adaptive reuse, and just more able to accommodate mixed use and other sorts of uses. He's spoken very highly of it, SDD districts.
Fantastic.
So
Anyone with success stories for SDD districts, send them to Chris.
he said West Hartford. He said he says nowadays almost everything in West Hartford is in SDD.
Cool. Alrighty. Anyone else want to share before we move on? Going once, going twice. All right, next. It's just other business, and I don't think we have any. Is that correct, Jen? Did you receive anything?
I didn't receive anything. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to discuss?
I'll just
If
say,
not, we have our next meeting. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so sorry, Jen. I was gonna say, regarding the next meeting, Jacob touched on it. We're looking to bring parking in some way, shape, or form as a topic to you all. Looking at a particular parking organization to shed some light, and then also contemplating trying to bring in a developer as well to the conversation, so you can get a little bit of strategies for ways you can rethink parking in your own communities, as well as sort of that, again, that market reality as well. So that's what we're working on for June. That's all.
Sounds good. And our next meeting's June 5th, just to clarify.
Correct, yes.
So if no one else has anything to discuss, would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Did I hear a second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank
you
you.
all.
See you
Thank you.
next time.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stop trying. Stop.